Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. I am so excited to be here today to talk about some climate change, sustainability, and events and what that means. And my friend Shawna is right there. And I was at IMEX 2 weeks ago, and Mark Cooper from IAC and I did a session. And we found out that only 10% of our attendees in that session of about 50 do any kind of sustainability in their RFPs and in their event planning practices. And that kind of startled Mark and I. But we chatted with some other people at the event and found the same exact answer. So I'm like, Shawna, can we talk about this? So Shawna, welcome. And I just need to tell everybody who you are. She is a sustainability consultant and instructor based in Vancouver, one of the prettiest cities in the world. And her company is named Clear Current Consulting. So welcome, Shawna.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Thanks. Okay, so going back to that statistic, and when I sent it to you, you're like, well, that's really goes in line with studies from SKIFT and North Star Meetings Group. And what was the other one that you pitched in?
Oh,
yes. Yeah. So really that's.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I hear the same things when I talk to my peers and my colleagues. It's like, I think people are at a point where there's so much going on in the world right now. It's like we get up in the morning and we have a to-do list that we're working on for our immediate event. And it's like, what do I have to triage today? So my biggest concerns are the things that are immediately in front of my face around cost and declining budgets and uncertainty in staff. And I think it's logical that people are we only have so much bandwidth to manage crisis. So if we're ranking our crises, the one that came out from SITE was really telling to me because we had 80% of incentive travel professionals indicating that rising cost was their biggest concern. And right down at the bottom of the list at 11% was climate change. Wow. And for me, I was like, oh, okay. And I had to step back because I was like, does that mean people don't care? Does that mean people aren't working on it? And what I've arrived at is I actually think it's a situation that climate change is an undercurrent of everything. So when I look at the things that people are most concerned about, that they're spending a lot of their time on, climate change has its fingerprints all over it. So when we're concerned about increasing cost, in a way, we're feeling a symptom of climate change. So we might not identify it as a top concern, but it's impacting those things that we are most concerned about. And I think the challenge is really finding the bandwidth to connect that issue strategically to the immediate problems we're facing. So it's not surprising that if we haven't had time to add it to an RFP, it's probably because we're dealing with other things, but we don't care about it. And that we don't connect it to that immediate issue. So I'm intrigued by the polling and the research and what people say, but I also find I often have to step back and say, okay, what's really going on below the surface? And how are these things that might not be showing up or happening actually connected to the problem we're experiencing? And how might it help us solve it as well?
Well, and that makes me think of the Sustainable Development Goals as well, because there's 17, which is from the United Nations, if anybody needs to understand that. And when I first saw them at Slow Food Terra Madre. I think it was back in 2018, maybe 16. But there's so many, the 17 standards, it covers just human decency and hunger, and people don't necessarily, might not relate that to sustainability, right? And it's a variety of different things under there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think how we each define sustainability is something that's really interesting to unpack. When we go into, an event planning pre-con and we say, how is the venue addressing sustainability? Or let's say we're on a site visit. It's always interesting to see what bubbles up, which gives you an indication, I think, of the kinds of issues people are thinking about. So the venue will tell you, oh, we've got the recycling bins. but they're not necessarily featuring perhaps what's going on in catering around food waste and food donation and nutrition and fair purchasing and their employee health and safety programs, because they're not, they're maybe focusing in on an issue that they're most familiar with, that they associate with the environment, but not necessarily social aspects. And the UN SDGs just help to give us that broader menu of issues to think about and intentions we can set.
Yeah, because you would not, I'm pretty sure there's probably a high number that wouldn't think that being kind and feeding other people, reducing hunger would fall underneath that, right? But it's they're looking at it as the sustainability of the earth in general, and that means sustaining people and reducing, homelessness, et cetera, right? That's all part of that. And maybe our corporate social responsibility activities already address those things and we don't even know it.
Yes. Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. So you mentioned climate change as an undercurrent to the biggest concerns of cost and event disruption and reduced attendance at events. So how can we work with both of those things, right? To increase our attendance. And it's a combination of looking at, hey, can we do the hybrid event? Meaning, and that's a whole nother conversation as well, but how can meeting planners, take that undercurrent that you get pulled under when you're in the ocean and actually benefit those things that they have as top issues?
Yeah, I think we have to separate here quick wins from long-term investments. So your original question asked about things like adding language to RFPs, which is sort of more of a systematic procedural thing that communicates to your suppliers that this is important to me. I want you to be working on this. I want to know what you're doing, and please be addressing, these specific areas. And those types of things are what help to shift the system. So it's the steps that we can take to expect a different way of doing business and changing some of the norms. And the challenge with some of those longer term solutions is sometimes they don't benefit us in our immediate meeting that we're planning right now. So we do have to take a bit of a long-term perspective here on, the things that we're planting seeds for now may not bear us fruit. They may not bear fruit for the next several events that we have, but over years and more people asking. This is the challenge sort of the sustainability dilemma, is the impact happens when we act collectively.
Okay.
But there are things that folks can do in the short term to do things like address the water or the carbon impact of their food by working with a caterer in an immediate meeting to plan to use those lower footprint ingredients or those fairer ingredients. So I sort of look at it in two ways. It's like, how will I take this on as an individual for my individual event to make a difference now?
Okay.
Yeah. Addressing things like food waste, plant-based diets, but things like RFPs and having conversations with our partners that are more strategic is about that long-term system change.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. Because you do planting the seed of the question, get somebody, well, I don't know the answer. And then that's actually kind of also sometimes we have to get past that CSM or that sales manager who's getting that question and we might get a little bit pushback on it nowadays, only for the fact that staff has changed and somebody new to the venue might not know how to answer that question, but hopefully they're confident and smart enough to go ask that question of someone else.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes it takes a venue. Like I can think back to venues that I worked with 10 years ago that there was, no preparation, no ability to respond to the questions we were asking then, but you actually come through the front doors right now and there's a whole program and strategy in place. And you're like, you know what, I may not have had yes back then, but 3-5 years later, look at how far that seed that was planted has come to shift the way that business happens. So change just takes time.
It does. And it was funny because I was at an event recently and not IMEX, and we were talking about DEI and methods of DEI. And I was like, well, food and beverage dietary needs are DEI. And this woman's like, well, I would never have thought of that. And sometimes I get annoyed by that. I'm like, why wouldn't you think that? Right. But then I also have to take that step back and like, people aren't looking at it from the perspective that I am. So how can I educate them instead? Right. Yes. So even just saying that and getting it out there, asking the questions gets people to think. And that's a way of education.
And I run into that because most of my work these days is focused on carbon and climate action in the environment. So there's lots of analysis I'm doing in this way. And it's always interesting to me that when I do the work, people file it under environment. It's about emissions, it's about climate change, and it's environmental responsibility. But for me, when I do the work, it's actually really about fairness and equity. Because by addressing emissions, we are creating a safer space for people who are vulnerable to live. It may not be, us that is living with the daily impact of climate change, but someone half a world away is living with the consequences of those emissions choices that we're making. And to be fair to them, we have to be responsible in our own behavior half a world away. So emissions to me are as much about the environment, as much about equity as they are about the environment. There's these wicked problems have very complicated environmental and social dimensions.
So that brings me to the comment that my friend Whitmire actually commented on the post when I first put it. It said, I'm hoping to catch it in between meetings. I would love to hear your thoughts on the implementation of carbon neutral events with location-based offsetting. And just a little bit of context for Whit is that he does work for a company, and I forgot the name of it, that is helping farmers, instead of tearing down trees to grow more farm crops, they're saying, no, let's work with you to actually do the carbon offsets for the trees that are on your land, so that it's a different environmental or a different form of income for them.
Okay.
So talk about that.
Yeah. So maybe the first thing that I'll just clarify is what a carbon offset is for anyone that's watching but isn't familiar with it. Essentially, when we offset our carbon footprint, we accept that our event or our individual choices have a carbon impact we can't avoid. And we pay money to another organization to reduce an equal amount of emissions somewhere else, or sequester or store an equal amount of emissions somewhere else. So if we're paying farmers not to, cut down trees, what we're doing is ensuring that they'll continue to exist and store that carbon. Now, the thing that every planner needs to know is carbon offsets are incredibly controversial, especially over the last, I would say, 18 months, because so many organizations are making commitments to net zero. There's a lot of projects that are flooding the market that aren't good quality, and a lot of sort of fly-by-night brokers. So there are good quality projects out there to support and very ethical operators. Planners need to plan to take time to do your due diligence to make sure that you're partnering with the right one, because the potential for greenwashing is really, really high right now. I've had some head-shaking things happen as I've been researching offset projects over the last couple of months. So just buyer beware is the thing I want to say. What I also want to add is that location-based offsetting, where people are choosing to offset, is really becoming quite popular. People want to have an impact in the communities where they're meeting or where their business is operating. So having that local connection is a strong thing to cultivate. I'll also add, though, that for some of the organizations that I'm working with, they're looking at those local contributions less as offsetting. So they're not necessarily using it to balance their carbon footprint. So they're not calling them offsets. They're actually calling them a couple of different things. Carbon mitigation, climate reparations is another term.
Wow.
So they're not actually using it as a way to apologize for their emissions because they're concerned about the risks associated with that, but they want to support these local projects. So they're saying, okay, what we're going to practice instead is not offsetting. It's more of a form of climate philanthropy, so acknowledging that we haven't reduced everything. We want to invest in projects that will help us to do that in the future, but we're not going to claim credit for it on our carbon balance sheet. So location-based offsets, I'd say for virtually all my clients, they're really looking for something in those communities to support. They're just not always calling it offsetting.
And could that be just a CSR project not related to carbon offsets, or?
So, yeah, that's a good question. So typically what they're doing is it has to have a climate related dimension. So they do look at things that will generate, not necessarily immediately, but eventually some type of climate benefit. So community garden projects, school gardens, food waste programs locally, planting trees, restoring wetlands. Probably the most popular thing would be that I've been, not the most popular, the most common thing that I've been involved with lately is actually peatland restoration.
What's that?
So peatlands, boglands.
Okay.
So a lot of people don't realize that the carbon storage potential of a peatland is actually greater than a forest. So where we avoid draining peatlands for things like agriculture or forestry, and we work to restore them, we actually really invest in a very powerful nature-based solution. Not to say that forests aren't good. Restoring forests is good. The carbon storage potential with peatlands is actually just a little bit stronger.
So PEATLAND.
Yeah, PEAT.
Okay. So like peat moss, that's the first word.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Gotcha. Well, and I just came from I toured the Javits Center in New York City, which podcast coming on that. It was awesome. But they built an acre farm on top of their building. But on the other side, I think it's the south building, it looks kind of peat, like just low lying vegetation, not farmland, not vegetation to eat, but they've by doing that, adding that on top of their roof, they now, instead of killing birds, which is what they were known for, the building was known for, they now have 35 species of birds that are living in and around that rooftop. They've got 5 different species of bats and I think 5 beehives. It's totally cool. I was blown away. So yeah, more to come on that. So that would be one way of doing that too, because they also are offsetting and they put solar panels on there on the top of the roof as well. So that helps in the same sense in a way.
Yeah. So this idea of sort of reparations or philanthropy instead of offsetting does open up more options for venues, for example, to inset programs. So maybe put a price on carbon and use that to store away some funds whereby you can, install a green roof or something like that in the future. Right. But it's not typically described as offsetting. So it's a bit of a shift in thinking about how it's framed.
Okay. I mean, I like planting gardens and planting new trees, right? That's in Atlanta. I remember Trees Atlanta was there. They would plant trees. That's a great program to partner with as well. So what are some strategic decisions about sustainability that are happening up here in the sea level, which some planners still aren't sitting at that sea level seat, that are trickling down that could impact the meetings and events, and how meeting planners could actually help facilitate and support those decisions that are being made, where C-suite might not even think that meetings and events are, have an impact on that?
Yeah, I think it's really, the time is now to understand what your value proposition is as a service in providing events to the organization, because what we've seen during the pandemic is the number of organizations making commitments to various sustainability pledges, like the Race to Zero, Net Zero. Typically, they're focused on climate action, and reducing emissions has just taken off. It's growing exponentially. So what's happened is, the organization is building out departments to do things like calculate carbon, to develop environmental safety and governance initiatives, so ESG initiatives, CSR initiatives. And the folks that are involved in that suite are looking across the organization for example, where are we generating emissions as a business operation? And typically where events start to feel it is where they start to unpack what's happening in connection with things like business travel.
Right.
It's probably is the thing that comes under the sharpest spotlight. So we look at organizations, and this is happening across sectors, so finance, insurance, pharmaceuticals, technology, and we can see that. So I'll name a few: PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, Salesforce, Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, AstraZeneca. These kinds of companies. Within the last 2 years, they have set really aggressive carbon reduction targets for their business travel. Between 20 and 70% of business travel emissions mandated to be reduced by 2030, some of them with even more aggressive timelines. So what happens if that suite doesn't understand the value of meetings is they tend to now not only ask us, is this worth the time and money, but does it provide a return on carbon? Because if we're going to host an event, we really want to make sure that the format we're using matches the outcome in the lowest carbon way. So that's why we continue to focus on virtual events, because where the outcome aligns with a virtual event format, like education or content sharing, why wouldn't we use that to connect our people? But where we need to meet in person, we want to make sure there's a really clear strategic outcome that makes that investment of carbon worthwhile. And in terms of how the event is executed, are we paying attention to sort of cross our T's and dot our I's that we're mindful of low carbon logistics? And that's where food comes into play quite a lot, because if we look at on-site impacts when we are face-to-face, food is, depending on the event, always a top 3 source of emissions. Very often it's number one for conference style events that are multi-days. So it does play a big role where the C-suite is willing to continue to invest in events and not sort of cut back on that budget. So it tends to be, if we're looking at the impacts of that, thinking smaller, thinking closer to home, thinking about maybe less frequently. So we're hosting things a third as much in person and supplementing with virtual. So it's a lot more variety and changes in scale.
So there's two things that come to mind on that. One is I do want you to break down and why food is that top three. What are the other two? And then why is food typically at the top of that? But then it reminds me of a story I heard at the exhibitor show probably 15 years ago. And it really didn't have anything to do with climate change, but it was a case study that was presented, and the company was one of the largest exhibitors in their industry trade show. And they balanced how much money they were spending with how much money they were making with client meetings, revenue generations from that. And they ended up pulling out of that show and doing regional meetings and going directly to their customers because their customers weren't coming to that show. And they tripled their revenue. They spent maybe $1 million more, but they tripled their revenue from what they were doing it. And so even though that it wasn't a case study on sustainability, but it's also a case study on, hey, look at what you're doing and how you're doing it, right?
What's the ultimate outcome that you're trying to drive and the best way to do it? I'd be really curious in that case study to learn if the regional format actually led to a net reduction. Right. Because depending on, how close those regions were, how many of them there were, we may actually find that the impact of that was higher. So it's those types of case studies that are really interesting to dig into, because I think they help us to get past some assumptions that we sometimes make, that it is lower or higher impact. I'm all about the show me the data. So I'd love to dig into a case study like that.
I know how to get you that, but I can connect you with them. But so going back to the carbon, why is food on that top on that list? So
the environmental impact of food is a lot higher than a lot of people sometimes assume it is. So are you familiar with Project Drawdown, Tracy? You heard of Project
I heard of it, but not enough.
So they're an organization that essentially looks at all of the suite of climate solutions that we have out there that we can take advantage of to reduce emissions. And it ranks them according to their potential to draw down emissions to zero. Okay. And if we look at the top 10 solutions, they rank over 100 of them, I think. Top 10 solutions, 3 of the top 10 solutions are related to food.
Wow.
So when we compare food to things like investing in solar energy, investing in electric vehicles, sustainable aviation fuel for planes, the top 3 of the top 10 are related to food. Do you have any guesses what they are? What you could do to draw down emissions related to food that would be quite powerful?
Well, cut food waste, because I know if food waste it would be the 3rd largest country on the planet because of the emissions it emits. So yes.
That's actually number 1. It tops their list. Highest potential of all greenhouse gas emission reduction solutions. Any guesses on the others?
Soil? Does it have
to put you on the spot or anything?
No. Does that have to do with soil?
Soil's on the list. It's not actually in the top 10, soil regeneration.
Oh, wow. Then no, I don't have any idea.
Water usage. You're going to go, when I mention the next one.
Okay.
Plant-based diets.
Really? Okay.
Plant-based diets is number 2. Okay. Number 9 is promoting cleaner forms of cooking, clean cook stoves. So you think of how often...
So not gas.
Gas in underdeveloped areas of the world where we're using wood and coal to cook food in homes. So it's not just commercial cooking, but residential cooking as well. But those 3 things... So combating food waste, number 1, number 2, plant-based diets, number 9, clean cook stoves. If we maximized potential in those 3 areas for carbon reductions, it would eliminate 200 gigatons of carbon. And I know people are sort of like, what does that even look like?
Right.
Yeah. 200 gigatons. It's the equivalent of taking all of the cars that are currently registered on the planet that run on fossil fuels off of the road for 25 years.
Wow.
The equivalent of 43 billion cars. We don't even have 43 billion cars or people on the planet, at this point in time. So the savings potential is massive. So what we do with food in our homes, at our meetings, at our events, in the workplace, it matters a lot, and it makes a big difference in terms of climate benefit. Okay. I don't know if that answers your question, but those 3 things are very powerful to pay attention to.
It does, but now I'm just going to say Melissa Riggle of the New Bern, the Craven County Tourism Development Authority, and our new mayor, Jeffrey Odom, I want to start composting in the town of New Bern. So just putting that out there on this video, I'm coming to you because I want to start composting.
Food waste.
Food waste.
Superpower.
Yeah, exactly. So I know I can't do it in my backyard because we got bears and deer. So that would be I need to take it somewhere else. But anyway, so Melissa and Mayor Odom. So food waste. And I talk about food waste in my sessions on sustainability. And to be honest with you, Shawna, when I started this, I was like, this is dietary restrictions, right? Here's food allergies, here's celiac, here's these 4 things. And now I add 5, which is physical disabilities, because somebody has to be able to get to the plate. But when I started this 12 years ago, it wasn't about food waste, but it really is about food waste, because if I'm ordering you a filet mignon and you're vegan, I've just wasted that filet mignon, and I've just wasted probably right now $165 of my budget, because the cost of that filet mignon dinner, including tax and gratuity, right, is that way. And actually, because we mentioned SITE, I remember meeting her. Won't say her name, but remember meeting a woman at an event, a SITE event, and she was telling me a story of an event she did in Spain, and she was witnessing a server in the back of the house or kitchen person scraping filet mignons, uncooked, uneaten filet mignons into the trash. And she was crying. And this woman asked her, she's like, why are you crying? She's like, because I can't afford to buy this for my family. And I'm just watching it all just go into the trash. And that just to me is reaps this whole sustainability, conversation and managing food waste. It's not just because I see the hole in the bottom of the bowl, right? Because I've scooped it out. Yeah. It's thinking about the pre-planning.
Yeah. And the person that's going hungry when you waste it, right?
Right. Yeah.
It is such a waste.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say, so what can planners do?
Yeah. Well, I think the key thing to be aware of, first of all, is that it's an issue, and addressing it is very powerful. It really is an environmental superpower that planners have. And I would suggest starting with your catering partners, just having conversations about it. Mm-hmm. And it can start as easy as asking them about, how do you approach your food waste? And not just from we compost and we donate food that's left over perspective. It's about, how are you addressing that in the pre-planning process, in terms of the portion sizes that you're presenting me, in terms of how you plate your food and whether or not it's preset, in terms of how you handle things like garnishing, in terms of how you stretch your ingredients, throughout a food plan for a meal that allows you to, if stuff is left over, keep it in the kitchen and repurpose it in other ways. So it's thinking about, downpipe, but ideally all of those uppipe things that reduce the need for composting and donation at the outset. And, the thing that's good is that it is such a financial issue that if you're not motivated by the waste itself from an environmental perspective, there's good financial motivation to look at it as well.
There is, because if you're cutting the size of your portions, and because nobody eats a piece of chicken, a piece of beef, and the vegetarian, the vegan option, and then all the sides to go with it, right? The 3 sides and the 3 dessert options. We don't need all of that, right? You don't get that at home. Yeah.
Yeah. No, just having reasonable expectations about portion size is a big thing. Right. I find, particularly when I, have events in the United States, the difference in portion sizes, which is, really quite staggering compared to when we're in events in other regions of the world. And just having that question about, do people really need a 6-ounce steak, or is, 3 ounces or 4, those types of questions. Is that enough? Does that match really the needs of our attendees in our group? And a few ideas.
Right. Yeah. And it does. Yeah. We don't need to be making, and we do that 3 meals a day and plus 2 breaks. Right. Yes. So do you eat that much, at home? Probably not. But we also need to get rid of that age old thing. Well, when people travel, they want to binge, they're breaking their habits. They're not anymore.
I don't think so. I think in particular, if we look at health, people are much more conscious of not just all the climate benefits and financial benefits of the food, eating in a smart way, but the health benefits are really obvious to us as well. And we're wanting to make those conscientious choices on the road too.
Right. Now, for those venues who just slap on one of those, I'm going to call it fake meat burgers or fish or chicken, is there, I want to get away from that. I would actually really just like to have food. And what about 3D printing? Because I saw some article the other day that we can 3D print a filet mignon. I'm like, okay, I don't really understand how that works, but
yeah, I think for venues or for caterers that aren't used to planning plant-based, this is where I think it's really helpful for a planner to really start to create their plant-based dossier, if you will, that you take with you. So you're aware of what type of plant-based options do your attendees want. Like there's multiple opportunities we have to talk to the board member or the advisory committee member or the exhibitor that we know is vegan about, how happy are you with the food? What would be better? And start to really amass ideas for things like recipes and options that aren't the hummus plate, aren't the vegetarian stir fry or the meat alternative burger or sausages or whatever the case may be. One of the things that some organizations I'm working with have done because they found it can be tough to shake loose that creativity for tasty plant-based food is they've actually invested in bringing in guest chefs. So they'll have a specialist who comes in sort of as a consulting chef where they invest in that as something that they're providing the venue to make sure that it's really about tasty, delicious, exciting plant-based food and not about, we feel like we're getting less as a result of that planning choice. So there are ways to get around it. It just, again, takes a bit of time. And I think, quite honestly, some safe transitioning because some events aren't quite prepared to go there while some events are prepared to fully go there. So looking at ways, how can I gradually transition this? Let's not talk about changing up the menu significantly, but maybe we're going to trim the beef. Maybe we're not going to go with the high carbon seafood this year. Maybe we're going to, go more meat light. So we are providing meat, but it's lighter meats on the planet, like chicken or fish or some that are at the lower end of the carbon spectrum. And then gradually increase that plant-based content to the menu in a way that may not even be noticed. And quite honestly, I've worked with clients who've gone completely plant-based and we're not getting complaints. People where you're thoughtful and approaching it in a way that it is tasty. It's like, it's a non-issue.
Right. If it's delicious and it's not just pasta primavera, which is the standard, and a bowl of berries, right? If it can be done that way, nobody's going to, it's like Mikey. If Mikey likes it, nobody's going to,
Exactly.
Everybody should like it. Right.
Yeah.
So there was something in there that you said.
Sorry, I should have taken a breath.
Oh, no, you're good. It's trying it out, but it's also finding that happy medium, right? And you don't have to go 100% plant-based your entire event at first, right? That might be a stark reality. Yep. And you also have to communicate that you're doing this because some people might have a challenge with it, right? Especially getting burned by what they've been served in the past.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And to encourage people along the path of gradual transition, over the last couple of years, I've been doing carbon analysis for menu transition that a client is doing. And the first choice that they made, they had a fairly typical mix of food at their multi-day conference event. It was roughly 30% high carbon meats like beef, 50% meat light, and the rest was a combination of vegetarian with dairy and plant-based food. The first thing they did was they got rid of beef. And it was a 30% reduction in that type of meal. And they supplemented with a combination of the other type of meals. The carbon footprint of that single choice, so a 30% transition, was a 58% reduction in carbon emissions.
Wow.
So now, the benefit of a gradual transition can be quite massive depending on the different choice you're making.
Okay, so this is my question that came up. One, how does a planner measure that? And two, where is that list of low carbon beef, right? Or foods? Where can we find that list?
Yeah, so first of all, reality check, carbon measurement for food is complicated. Environmental footprint measurement for food is complicated. So if you are a person that wants to get custom analysis done for your catering menu, it is a situation of needing to look to hire a professional because we need, folks need to look at your specific supply chain, the specific foods that you're using. Okay. That said, if planners are just interested in answering what I call a stump the sustainability consultant type question, like should I serve? So let's imagine you're doing a plated function or you're making a choice about your starchy sides and you're choosing between rice, pasta, and potatoes. Any guesses which has the lowest footprint? Rice, pasta, potatoes?
Potatoes.
Yep. Potatoes are lowest, especially if they're in season. They come quite close to pasta and bread if they're in the off season, but they're always lowest in terms of water and carbon footprint. And you can easily find that out if you look up Oxford University's Our World in Data, their Food Explorer.
Okay.
And it is a really powerful tool. You can actually filter for what you're serving at your break. So if you're picking between banana bread and a protein bar and an apple, and there's a filterable, searchable tool that they have that will give you the carbon, water, and pollution footprint of those different types of food so that you can just get in a snapshot, oh, yes, I probably should be going with the apples and bananas because they are lower carbon, lower water, lower polluting. Incidentally, protein bars are the highest. Quite high, actually, compared to some of those other snacks that you might serve during breaks. You can also answer questions. They have a great explorer on plant-based milks. Everyone's serving plant-based milk. So which one is it? Oh, is it rice? Is it soy? Is it almond? That comes up top.
Almond uses a lot of water. I know that.
Yeah. Water is the worst almond is worse from a water perspective. It's best from a carbon perspective. So the space
that's a balance.
Tough to look at. That's why a lot of people sometimes I'm finding are defaulting to things like soy or things like, if not soy, because I know there's issues with that as well, almond milk tends to be more middle of the road, but they have you can answer that question. So I highly recommend that tool. If you can't afford to hire a consultant, it's a great way to just get a snapshot.
All right. Oxford University, Our World in Data.
Yeah, I can't send a link what I'm on right now. I'll post a link to the webinar, so it's there in the bottom for folks to check out.
All right, awesome. Thanks. That would be great. Okay, so one of the things that we talked about before the show was the stress of all of this. Like trying to do this and because meeting planners already have one of the top 5 most stressful jobs in the world, right? Behind an Army general and an airplane pilot, so how do we manage that, the stress and the emotions around this, so that you're not getting backlash from people saying, oh my God, all you're serving is plant-based food, or how am I reducing my carbon? I don't even understand all of this. How do we reduce that stress?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. And it's such an important question. I'm glad you're answering it because I have to say, I struggle with my own emotions around the environment and climate change. And I found it's tough to talk to people and find people that are experiencing the same thing in the event space. So if anyone's feeling this issue, they want to reach out, talk about it, let me know. I experience it most with students in my classroom. Most of my students are in their early 20s, mid 20s. And when we get to our unit on climate change, watch for students to either become really concerned and frustrated and emotional about the topic, or to completely sort of step back, shut down, and sort of feel hopeless about the situation. So I just really want to say this is a critical issue, and it's becoming more apparent as climate issues land on our doorstep, that these are emotions and feelings that we're all struggling with. All I can say is I'm not a climate psychologist. I seek out resources myself through initiatives like Gen Dread and Project Inside Out and the All We Can Save project to sort of sort through what I'm feeling and find ways that I can try and support others. I find the most important thing is to allow yourself to rest and hit pause because, it's exhausting trying to save the world all on your own, and that's not a reasonable thing to expect an event planner to do. So I think we need to take space and give people space to find the time to figure out what they're feeling and what they want to do with those feelings, and not necessarily assume a response that is going to work for them, because what drives me isn't necessarily what's going to get someone else through it. So finding that space and hitting pause and figuring out what you're feeling and where you want to go with it, I think is the most important thing to do, because we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves and we need to take a break. That said, I will say that there's a tension there, because when it comes to climate, there are people who don't have the luxury of hitting pause when they're dealing with the impact of these issues. So I think that we need to afford ourselves time, but also realize we have a role to play in helping everyone get through this together. It's just finding out the way that that you can fit it in to your job in a way that works for you and doesn't cause that overwhelm. And if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm more than happy to wrestle with that with you, because I do it on a daily basis, quite honestly.
Well, and I think it's also too, is like looking at your job as a planner, and we've always had this discussion of getting into the C-suite level, right? To have this conversation, because events are strategic business initiatives. And when you're looking at, why are you hosting this event? Oh, because we've always done it. Well, you also now have these initiatives that you want from climate change coming here. So this has to come into play here. So it's really, and I know there's planners out there, and this is no fault or nothing, that are really just focused on the strategy side. And then there's people that are focused on the logistics side. And whichever way you do it is great, but you also need to see that you've got to mesh with both sides of that.
Yes. I couldn't agree more with that statement, because it's like for some years we've almost over-focused on the tactics and the checklist and the standards, and we've forgotten that we need to be creating experiences that help people to find solutions and take action and support each other. And that's where the experience design and the wonderful things we can do at events really come into play. So those two things working together, I think, are really critical. It's finding the right balance between those.
Yeah. And if there's a big focus in your company or with your client that's coming, hey, we want to focus on this, then we need to say, okay, well, I need to hire another person to do this, right? Because I can't add that to my plate. Know what's already on your plate, which is a lot, but manage that and say, okay, well, if you want that, then here's the additional expense for that. And maybe looking at it, hey, if we do this, that expense is going to get paid for by what we do, by what is accomplished, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just, you got to know your numbers that's as well.
Yeah. And I think just a side note, I think we have to realize that sustainability is a valuable skill. Yeah. And I think for a lot of times we've been expecting planners to just sort of figure it out, and they haven't necessarily come with the background of a carbon analyst and an ethics expert or anything like that, or an accessibility expert. So being able to invest in our planning teams to have them develop these skills so they have the resources and the knowledge and the capacity to do it themselves, I think is a benefit that we could do better providing within our organizations and our agencies.
Exactly. Okay. So just because I asked you these questions before we went on air, I know we're coming up at 43 minutes here, so we could probably talk forever. But I liked the statement that you said, is you can really tell a lot about a caterer, a venue, a hotel, and a group of participants from how they treat food and waste service workers. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the question you had asked me was if there's a negative experience that I've had and sort of how they've impacted me. I won't name names or venues or caterers or events, but I can, point to a number of times in the past where I've seen so many different things. People treat waste workers as in people disparaging quality service workers, treating them really poorly when they're just trying to deliver good service, or, maybe are on the 16th hour of their shift. And I've seen it from event participants. I've seen it from senior management in venues and caterers. And I find it really, I hate to say it, but oftentimes it's the feeling that I'm left with about that venue and caterer that sticks with me. That's really hard to let go of, particularly if those managers stay around. So as much as I harp on about emissions and climate, it's about how we treat our people and how we're good humans to other humans that makes a lasting impression.
So true. And I remember seeing a kid, I say that because I'm 54 and he was a kid to me, but he was cleaning the inside of the trash cans at a hotel venue. And I stopped and I thanked him. I'm like, I really appreciate what you're doing. And it took him aback, right? Like, why? I'm like, because that venue wants to make sure that trash can looks clean because it's out in the public, right? But that's a dirty job.
Yeah, it is.
And
sorry, go ahead.
He's a young kid thinking this is what I'm doing for a living, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a job that it can be demeaning to some people. And when someone treats them poorly or looks at them as the janitor, as some people often do, it's a very hard job. Yeah. And stopping and thanking is a simple thing that everyone can do.
I do that in Vegas as well, because I'm one of those very early morning walkers, and every person that's buffing the glass or the brass on the streets and cleaning, and I really do. I say thank you for what you're doing. One, because you're up at the crack of before dawn, right, doing this, and two, it's a job that we take for granted, and the city of Las Vegas would not look as well as it does without those people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so two final questions, and because I want to talk about your food, I want to talk about food ritual, because I asked you, what is your favorite food and beverage? And you said, I love food rituals. So what is that?
Yeah, not a very exciting foodie. Not that I don't like food and not adventurous with it, but I'm a ritual person, and tea and cookies in the afternoon. Like I don't know if it's my English grandma's upbringing, but my ideal event is a place where I can go and clutch a hot drink and just watch, go around and sample cookies. It's the way to my heart, really.
Well, and the fact that you met your English grandmother, I was going to say, is the Queen there? Is Paddington Bear there? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very comforting. I don't know. The comforting, happy feeling to it.
Yes. Okay. So the final question that I have, that I ask everybody, what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience mean to you? And I leave you with a very hard question.
Yeah, that's I think for me, when I think about fundamentally what our food is about, it's about nourishing us. And when we sit down to an experience, it's about, thinking about the nutritional value, but it's about thinking about so much more than that, and the richness that food brings our lives in terms of the stories it tells us. This is one of the reasons why I know one of the things I know we don't have time to discuss is Indigenous food. Sort of the story it tells and how it connects us to the place where we are at a given moment in time and the people who have lived there for a very long time. It connects us to the people around us who prepare it and work so hard to keep us nourished. And it's a very emotional thing, and where you see all of those things happen so that you can feel good about what you're eating because people were cared for in the preparation of it. It tells a story of the place you are. Folks were treated fairly, and it does good for the planet. You walk away feeling full in so many different ways other than your stomach.
I love that. That's so true. That is so true. And when we thank our culinary teams at the end of an event, right? Because they fed us. To me, that's a really important ritual as well, to say, to bring them out and let everybody see them. In one way you could say, hey, that's putting you on display, but it's also, I want to, because you are the one feeding us, Yeah. So Shawna, thank you so much for joining me, and everybody just put her LinkedIn profile on here up on the screen, and I will actually pop it into the comments as well, so you know how to reach her. But I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today.
Tracy, thank you for the questions and the conversation space.
You're welcome, and continue. I will follow you, and thank you for everything that you do to help sustain our world.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, everybody. Until next time, stay safe and eat well. Actually, I think I'm going to bring you live from Chapel Hill next week with a chocolate and kombucha tasting. I am just making sure the details work out fine on that. The technology details work out on that. So until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.